Welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our discussion on how slavery divides a nation. Today, we're going to be focusing on Daniel Webster, the Compromise of 1850 debate, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, today's guiding question is, what does Calhoun's deathbed statement foreshadow? All right, y'all, let's talk about Daniel Webster. One of the big names in this heated debate was Daniel Webster. He was from Massachusetts, but when he spoke to the Senate, he made it clear that he was not just representing his state or the North. Nope. He said, and I quote, I speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. There can be no such thing as a peaceful secession, end quote. Now, what does that mean? Well, in other words, Webster was saying, y'all, this whole breaking up of the country idea, not going to happen peacefully. No way, no how. Now, Webster wasn't a fan of slavery. He thought it was straight up wrong, but he believed that if the country split apart, it would be even worse than allowing slavery to continue. He was so determined to keep the United States together that he was willing to compromise, even if it meant agreeing to a law that forced Northerners to return runaway slaves. That decision made a lot of abolitionists, who were people who wanted to end slavery, furious. But Webster stood by it because he believed the Union had to come first. A lot was happening in 1850. First, you had John C. Calhoun, the dude from South Carolina who was all about states' rights and protecting slavery. You remember the one that always wanted to take his ball and go home and threaten secession whenever he got upset? Well, yeah, him. Well, he died. And his last words, supposedly, he said, and I quote, the South, the poor South. God knows what will become of her now. Now, according to those were his words, that tells you how worried he was about what was coming. Then, to add in to make things even worse, President Zachary Taylor also died. This was a crazy year. I'm telling you, you're feeling me? It was right. The new president, Millard Fillmore, had a totally different view. Unlike Taylor, who was against compromise, Fillmore was all for it. Now, then there's also still Henry Clay, Mr. Great Compromiser himself. He was the one pushing for this big plan, the Compromise of 1850. Now remember, don't mix this up with the Missouri Compromise, which was also Clay's idea. There was the Compromise of 1850, which is what we're talking about now, but then there was also the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Both compromises were Clay's idea. That one, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, was about keeping the balance between free and slave states. The Compromise of 1850 was all about what to do now that California wanted to join the Union. Clay was out there working hard, giving 70 speeches to convince people this was the best way to keep the country together. But here's the thing, Clay was also getting old, and eventually he got too sick to keep up the fight. That's when Stephen Douglas from Illinois stepped in. He took over and helped push the Compromise of 1850 through Congress. Without Douglas, it might not have passed at all. So the bottom line is, this was a turning point in American history. Leaders were trying to hold the country together, but tensions over slavery were growing. And as Webster predicted, peace wasn't going to last that much longer. By the early 1800s, the North and South were already butting heads over slavery. Every time a new state wanted to join the U.S., the big question was, would it allow slavery or not? Neither side wanted to be outnumbered in Congress, so they had to come up with compromises to keep the balance. Two major deals were made to try to keep the peace: the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. Both were designed to stop the country from falling apart, but as we know, that didn't last forever. So let's break them down. Once again, Henry Clay was the mastermind behind both of these deals. Number two, California was meant as a free state, which was a big win for the North. Number three, the rest of the land from the Mexican cession was split into Utah and New Mexico territories. People would vote on whether or not to allow slavery. This was known as popular sovereignty. Number 4, no more slave trade in Washington, D.C. However, slavery itself was still legal. Number 5, a super strict fugitive slave law was passed where runaway slaves had to be returned and anyone who helped them could get into trouble. Number 6, it also settled a border dispute between Texas and New Mexico. The bottom line, both of these compromises were meant to keep the North and South from fighting. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 worked for a while, but by 1850, tensions were getting worse. The Compromise of 1850 was just another attempt to keep the peace, but spoiler alert, it didn't last. The Civil War was just around the corner. Now, imagine this. You're walking down the street and someone tells you that you have to help capture a runaway slave, even if you don't believe in slavery. If you refuse, you could be fined a huge amount of money or even thrown in jail. Sounds unfair, right? Well, that's exactly what the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 did. This law forced all U.S. citizens, even those in free states, to help capture and return escaped slaves. If someone was caught helping a runaway, they could be fined $1,000, which was a ton of money back then, or even thrown in jail. But that's not all. The law also set up special courts to decide the fate of accused runaways. And guess what? These courts were not fair. One, there were no jury trials. What does that mean? Well, a person accused of being a runaway slave had no right to defend themselves in court because they were not allowed to speak for themselves in court. Number 2, you had bribed judges. Judges were paid $10 for sending someone to the South, but they were only paid $5 if they set them free. So what does that say? So this meant many judges made decisions based on money, not justice. Some free African Americans were even kidnapped and sent into slavery because of this system. The Fugitive Slave Act infuriated many Northerners. Even those who didn't care much about slavery before were now forced to take part in it. Many felt like they were being dragged into the slave system against their will. Some refused to follow the law, helping escape slaves instead. Others formed mobs to try and rescue captured runaways. Abolitionists grew louder, and more Northerners started believing that slavery was wrong and evil. Even though the Compromise of 1850 was meant to keep the peace, this law did the opposite. It made tensions between the North and South even worse. Every time the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced, more people turned against slavery, pushing the country closer to civil war. Well, that's all for today. Join us the next time where we will be discussing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the politicians fighting in the Senate. And remember, past shaped today, but you shape tomorrow. Make it count. Take care. Bye-bye.